The morning of June 4th, 1942. 6,000 feet above the Pacific, Lieutenant Commander John Thach squints through the glare of tropical sun, his Grumman F4F Wildcat bucking slightly in the turbulent air. Below him, 12 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers crawl toward the Japanese fleet like fat, slow insects. Thach knows what's about to happen. Every pilot in his six-plane escort knows. The Devastators are flying coffins, obsolete the moment this war began, and somewhere out there, between 15 and 20 Mitsubishi Zeros are closing fast, their pilots hungry, experienced, flying the most maneuverable fighter aircraft anyone has ever put in the sky. Thach's radio crackles. Then the Zeros hit. One of his Wildcats, Ensign Edgar Bassett's plane, takes fire almost immediately. Flames blossom from the cowling. The aircraft slants downward, trailing black smoke, and disappears toward the ocean. 4 seconds into the fight, Thach has lost 20% of his force. The remaining Wildcats scatter, trying to protect the lumbering torpedo bombers below, but the mathematics are brutal. 6 Wildcats against 20 Zeros, slower aircraft against faster, less maneuverable against fighters that can turn inside anything the Americans have ever fielded. Every tactical doctrine Thach learned at Pensacola, every principle taught in flight school, every lesson from the last war, says this fight is already over. Except Thach isn't following doctrine anymore. 3 months ago, sitting at his kitchen table in San Diego with a handful of matchsticks, he'd worked out something different, something counterintuitive, something that violated every instinct a fighter pilot possessed. Now, 6,000 feet above the largest naval battle in history, with Zeros swarming through his formation like hornets, Thach keys his radio and gives an order that will change aerial warfare forever. Ram, turn into me, now. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ensign Robert Dibb, 22 years old, fresh out of flight training, hesitates for half a second. Then he banks hard left, directly toward his squadron commander's aircraft. To any pilot watching from outside, it looks like suicide. 2 friendly fighters on a collision course, with a Zero closing fast on Dibb's tail. The Japanese pilot sees an easy kill. He follows Dibb into the turn, lining up for a deflection shot that will tear the Wildcat apart. What he doesn't see is Thach, diving underneath his wingman's aircraft, coming up at a perfect angle with his 650 caliber machine guns already firing. Thach's bullets stitch a line across the Zero's belly. The Japanese fighter's engine coughs, flames erupt from the cowling, and the aircraft rolls inverted, trailing fire toward the Pacific. The Thach Weave had just saved its first life in combat. Within 3 years, it would help American pilots destroy over 5,000 Japanese aircraft. The story of how that happened, how a tactic designed for inferior aircraft became the foundation for one of the most lopsided air campaigns in military history, begins not with technology or industrial might, but with one man's willingness to accept a humiliating truth. American fighters were outmatched, completely, undeniably outmatched, and pretending otherwise was killing pilots by the dozen. In September 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander John Thach sat in his office at Naval Air Station San Diego, reading an intelligence bulletin that made his stomach sink. Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin No. 6, dated September 22nd, contained specifications for a new Japanese fighter aircraft that had been operating in China since July 1940. The Mitsubishi A6M, codenamed Zero, possessed capabilities that seemed impossible. Maximum speed of 331 miles per hour at 16,000 feet, rate of climb exceeding 4,000 feet per minute, service ceiling of 33,000 feet, combat radius of 1,100 miles, and, most disturbing of all, a turn rate that allowed the aircraft to complete a full circle in less time than any American fighter could manage. Thach read the report 3 times. He walked down to the flight line and looked at his squadron's Wildcats, their stubby fuselages and thick wings, and he did the calculations in his head. The Wildcat could barely exceed 300 miles per hour in level flight. Its rate of climb was adequate, nothing special. And in a turning fight, the kind of dogfight every American pilot trained for, the Zero could turn inside the Wildcat so tightly that American pilots would never get a shot. The Zero pilot would simply spiral tighter and tighter until he sat perfectly positioned on the Wildcat's tail, with all the time in the world to line up a killing burst. Thach had spent a decade in naval aviation. He'd served as a test pilot, taught aerial gunnery, developed a reputation as one of the Navy's most thoughtful tacticians. He understood aircraft performance the way a musician understands harmony, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that if American pilots tried to dogfight Zeros using conventional tactics, they would die. Not might die, would die. That night, Thach sat at his kitchen table with a box of matchsticks. He'd done this before, using small objects to represent aircraft, moving them around to visualize three-dimensional combat. It was how he thought through tactical problems, by making them physical, concrete, something he could manipulate with his hands. He arranged the matchsticks in the standard three-plane section the Navy used at the time, a flight leader and two wingmen, flying in a V formation. Then he moved other matchsticks to represent attacking Zeros, coming in from various angles. Every scenario ended the same way. The Zeros got inside the Wildcat's turn radius. The Zeros achieved firing position. The Wildcats died. Thach rearranged the matchsticks. He tried wider spacing. He tried different formations. He tried having the Wildcats break in opposite directions. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem wasn't formation geometry. It was physics. You couldn't outturn an aircraft that could turn tighter than yours. No amount of clever maneuvering changed that basic fact. Unless. What if you stopped trying to outturn the Zero? What if you accepted that the Zero was more maneuverable and designed a tactic that made maneuverability irrelevant? Thach moved the matchsticks again. This time he arranged them differently. Two pairs of fighters, flying abreast, separated by about the distance of a Wildcat's turning diameter, maybe 1,000 feet. When one pair got jumped by Zeros, instead of trying to shake them off through individual maneuvering, both pairs would turn toward each other. Hard, committed turns, crossing paths, then continuing until they were separated again by that same 1,000-foot distance. Then they'd repeat it, turn toward each other, cross, separate, turn again. The genius of it was simple but profound. A Zero following one pair of Wildcats into a turn would suddenly find himself facing the other pair, head-on, with all their guns pointed directly at him. The Zero pilot had three choices, all bad. He could break off his attack and escape. He could try to continue through the head-on pass, in which case he'd take fire from multiple aircraft, while his own guns had only a brief moment to shoot. Or he could try to turn with the Wildcats he was chasing, in which case the other pair would end up perfectly positioned on his tail. The maneuver didn't require the Wildcats to turn tighter than the Zero. It just required coordination and discipline. The Zero's superior maneuverability became a liability because the Japanese pilot kept finding himself in head-on engagements he couldn't win. Thach tested the theory the next morning with his squadron. He took 4 Wildcats up, split them into 2 pairs, and had them practice the weaving turns. It felt awkward at first. Fighter pilots were trained to stick close together, to maintain tight formations. This tactic required them to separate, to trust their wingman even when he was 1,000 feet away, almost out of sight. But after a few practice runs, the rhythm became natural. Turn toward your partner, cross, separate, turn again, like a figure 8 laid on its side, endlessly repeating. The real test came when Thach asked Ensign Edgar Bassett, one of his best pilots, to play the role of attacking Japanese fighters. O'Hare took 4 Wildcats, unrestricted power, and tried every attack angle he could think of. Diving attacks, level attacks, attacks from behind, from the side, from below. Every time, he found himself facing the nose of a Wildcat with guns pointed at him. After landing, O'Hare climbed out of his cockpit grinning. "Skipper, it really worked. I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me." Thach wrote up his findings and submitted them through channels. The Navy's response was polite but skeptical. The three-plane section was standard across all fighter aviation, American and foreign. It had been tested in Spain, over China, in the early months of the European War. Changing it would require rewriting tactical doctrine, retraining every fighter pilot in the fleet, and for what? To counter a Japanese fighter that might not even be as good as the intelligence reports suggested? The reports from China could be exaggerated. Everyone knew the Chinese had a tendency to overestimate Japanese capabilities. The Zero was probably just a good aircraft, not the superfighter the reports made it sound like. Then, December 7th, 1941 happened, Pearl Harbor. Zeros strafing airfields in the Philippines. Within weeks, reports started, coming back from combat pilots who'd actually fought the Zero. The intelligence bulletins had been conservative, if anything. The Zero was everything the reports said and more. Pilots who tried to dogfight them didn't come back. The ones who did come back told stories about Japanese fighters that could climb like rockets, turn on a dime, and seem to hover in the air while American planes stalled trying to match their maneuvers. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, Executive Officer of Fighter Squadron 42, encountered Zeros during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. His after-action report was blunt. Traditional three-plane sections were death traps. Pilots in the third position, the trailing wingman, became easy targets because they spent all their attention trying to maintain formation instead of watching for threats. Flatley had independently developed ideas similar to Thach's. Two-plane elements, mutual support, coordinated defensive maneuvers. After Coral Sea, Flatley got 30 days leave. He spent it in Coronado, California, where Thach was also on leave. The two men met, compared notes, and discovered they'd reached almost identical conclusions. The four-plane division, split into two-plane elements, was the only formation that worked against superior enemy fighters. Flatley tested variations during training at North Island. He tried six-plane formations, thinking more aircraft might provide better mutual support. It didn't work. The extra planes got lost during maneuvers, couldn't maintain the coordination the tactic required. The four-plane division was optimal, small enough to stay together, large enough to provide overlapping fields of fire. Flatley sent two messages to Thach, one personal, one official. The personal message said, "I'm calling it the Thach Weave, for your information." The official message recommended immediate fleet-wide adoption. But doctrine changes slowly in military organizations, especially during wartime, when there's barely time to train replacement pilots in basic flying, much less revolutionary new tactics. Through the spring of 1942, some squadrons adopted the Thach Weave, others stuck with traditional formations. The results showed up in casualty reports. Squadrons using mutual support tactics and two-plane elements had better survival rates. Squadrons still flying three-plane sections lost pilots at alarming rates. Then came Midway, June 4, 1942. Thach led 6 Wildcats as escort for Torpedo Squadron 3. He'd wanted to brief all his pilots on the Weave maneuver, but his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Donald Lovelace, had died in a deck accident just days before the battle. Lovelace was the one who was supposed to train the newer pilots, explain the tactic to them in detail. Now Thach was heading into the largest air battle of the war with a mixed group, some pilots who understood the Weave, others who'd barely heard of it. The Zeros hit Thach's formation within minutes of reaching the Japanese fleet. Ensign Bassett's Wildcat went down almost immediately. The remaining 5 scattered, trying to protect the torpedo bombers while also defending themselves against overwhelming numbers. Thach's wingman, Ensign Robert Ram Dib, was still green. Basic flight school, a handful of carrier landings, almost no air combat training. When a Zero locked onto his tail, Dib's radio call was pure panic. "There's a Zero on my tail." Thach didn't hesitate. "Turn into me, now." Dib turned. Thach dove under him, came up firing, and the Zero that had been about to kill Dib instead exploded in a ball of fire. They kept weaving, turn toward each other, cross, separate, turn again. The Zeros swarmed around them but couldn't get a clean shot. Every time a Japanese pilot committed to an attack run, he found himself facing head-on fire from the other section. Thach shot down 3 Zeros that morning. His division shot down 6 confirmed, and critically, most of his pilots made it back to the carrier. Not all. But in a fight where the Wildcats were outnumbered 4-1, by aircraft that were fundamentally superior in every performance metric, Thach's men survived. His after-action report that evening was brutally honest. It is indeed surprising that any of our pilots returned alive. Any success our fighter pilots may have against the Japanese Zero fighter is not due to the performance of the airplane we fly, but is the result of the comparatively poor marksmanship of the Japanese, stupid mistakes made by a few of their pilots, and superior marksmanship and teamwork of some of our pilots. Thach warned that unless the Wildcats' performance could be improved, American pilots couldn't carry out their mission, and if they couldn't protect the carriers wouldn't survive. The Navy had known for months that new fighters were in development. The Vought F4U Corsair showed promise but was having problems with carrier landings, visibility issues, bounce on touchdown. It would take time to fix. The other option was Grumman's new design, the F6F. The prototype had flown on June 26, 1942, 4 weeks before Midway. It was bigger than the Wildcat, heavier. Powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, the same power plant used in the Corsair and the Army's P-47 Thunderbolt. On paper, the F6F looked like it might finally give American pilots an aircraft that could match the Zero, but paper specifications didn't mean combat effectiveness. The Navy needed to know if this new fighter could actually do the job. In July 1942, Grumman engineer Jake Swerble flew to Hawaii and sat down with John Thach. What did the Navy's best tactician think the new fighter needed? Thach's list was specific. More power, obviously, but also armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant control systems, an aircraft that could take punishment and bring the pilot home. Thach had watched too many Wildcats burn after a single hit. Japanese pilots aimed for fuel tanks. One tracer round through an unprotected tank and the whole aircraft became an inferno. American pilots needed a fighter that could absorb that hit and keep flying. Thach also emphasized that no fighter, no matter how good, would succeed without proper tactics. The Thach weave wasn't a temporary fix for the Wildcats' limitations. It was the foundation of a completely different approach to air combat. Individual dueling, the romantic image of the fighter ace engaging enemy pilots one-on-one through superior skill and daring, was obsolete. Modern air combat required teamwork, mutual support, pilots who trusted each other absolutely and could execute coordinated maneuvers under fire without needing constant radio communication. The new fighter needed to be designed with that tactical reality in mind. Grumman listened. The F6F incorporated every lesson from combat reports: armor plate behind the pilot's seat, armored glass windscreen, self-sealing fuel tanks, 6 50-caliber machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, a robust airframe that could handle carrier landings, pilot errors, and combat damage. The aircraft was heavy, over 9,000 pounds empty weight, nearly 3 times what a Zero weighed. But that weight brought survivability. The first production F6F3 flew in October 1942. Deliveries to fleet squadrons began in January 1943. By August 1943, Hellcats were flying combat missions in the Pacific. The name itself was perfect. The F4F had been the Wildcat. The F6F was the Hellcat. Bigger, meaner, built to dominate. Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, the same pilot who'd helped Thach test the weave maneuver in San Diego, was one of the first to fly the Hellcat in combat. His assessment was enthusiastic. The aircraft was everything the Wildcat wasn't: fast enough to dive away from trouble, strong enough to survive hits that would destroy a Japanese fighter, armed heavily enough to obliterate targets with a 2-second burst. And critically, it retained excellent low-speed handling, which meant pilots could still execute the weaving defensive maneuvers that had kept them alive in Wildcats. The marriage of aircraft and tactics, Hellcat and Weave, began producing results immediately. Fighting Squadron 5, operating from USS Yorktown, scored Hellcat's first kills on August 31, 1943, during a raid on Marcus Island. By November 1943, during the battle over Tarawa, Hellcats engaged Zero fighters and achieved a 30-to-1 kill ratio. 30 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost. The number seemed impossible, but it kept happening. Battle after battle, engagement after engagement, American pilots flying Hellcats in coordinated pairs were systematically destroying Japanese air power. Japanese pilots noticed. Reports started coming back to their commands describing a new American tactic. 2 fighters, flying apart but clearly coordinated, weaving back and forth in a pattern that made them nearly impossible to attack. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces, encountered the Thach weave over Guadalcanal. His squadron leader, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, tried repeatedly to shoot down what looked like an easy target, a single Wildcat flying alone. But every time Nakajima got close, another Wildcat appeared from an unexpected angle, forcing him to break off. Nakajima returned to base furious. He'd been outmaneuvered by aircraft that were supposed to be inferior. What Japanese pilots couldn't fully understand was that the tactic wasn't about individual aircraft performance anymore. The Thach weave transformed 2 fighters into a single defensive system. Like a living organism with multiple eyes and multiple weapons, covering each other's blind spots, creating kill zones that enemy pilots entered at their peril. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized individual skill, the samurai tradition, one pilot against another, may the better man win. The Thach weave rejected that entire philosophy. It didn't matter if a Japanese pilot was more skilled. It didn't matter if his aircraft could turn tighter. He was fighting a system, not an individual. And systems, properly designed, beat individuals every time. By early 1944, Hellcats had become the standard fighter on American carriers. The F4F Wildcat was being phased out except for escort carrier duty. The F4U Corsair had finally solved its carrier landing problems and was also entering service, though primarily with Marine Corps squadrons operating from land bases. But the Hellcat was the workhorse. 12,275 would eventually be built. At peak production, Grumman was delivering 500 per month. At one point, a new Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every hour, around the clock. Training for new pilots emphasized the tactics that had proven effective. 2 plain elements: mutual support, the Thach weave as a defensive maneuver when outnumbered or surprised. But increasingly, Hellcat pilots weren't fighting defensively at all. The aircraft's speed advantage meant American pilots could choose when and where to engage. They'd dive from altitude, make a high-speed firing pass, then use their superior dive speed to climb back up beyond the Zero's reach. Boom and zoom, it was called. Thach weave when forced into a turning fight, boom and zoom when you controlled the engagement. Either way, teamwork was paramount. The ultimate test of these tactics came in June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American intelligence knew a major Japanese carrier strike was coming. Admiral Mark Mitch's Task Force 58, built around 15 aircraft carriers, prepared to meet it. 480 F-6F Hellcats were positioned to intercept what would be one of the largest air battles in history. June 19, 1944. Japanese carriers launched 4 massive raids against the American fleet. Wave after wave of aircraft, hundreds of them, bombers and fighters mixed together, the kind of armada that would have been devastating in 1942. But this was 1944. The Hellcats were waiting. The first Japanese raid consisted of 69 aircraft. 42 were shot down before they even reached the American fleet. The second raid lost over 100 aircraft out of 128 launched. By the end of the day, Japan had lost approximately 300 aircraft. American losses were around 30. The battle became known, semi-officially, as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese planes falling from the sky so fast that American pilots stopped making detailed after-action reports because there were simply too many kills to document individually. The slaughter wasn't just about aircraft performance, though the Hellcat's advantages helped. It was about training, tactics, and the complete integration of those elements into a coherent fighting system. American pilots had 300 hours of flight training before seeing combat. Japanese pilots, by mid-1944, were getting barely 100 hours due to fuel shortages and accelerated training schedules. American pilots flew in coordinated divisions using the Thach weave and other mutual support tactics. Japanese pilots, even the experienced ones, were reverting to individual combat because they didn't have wingmen they could trust. Their rookie pilots simply didn't have the skills to maintain formation under fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And there was another factor, one that John Thach had emphasized from the beginning: pilot survivability. When a Hellcat got hit, the pilot usually walked away. Self-sealing tanks prevented fires. Armor stopped bullets. Redundant control systems meant one severed cable didn't send the aircraft tumbling out of the sky. American pilots who survived being shot down could be rescued by submarines or flying boats positioned for that purpose. They'd heal, get back in a cockpit, and return to combat with valuable experience. Japanese pilots flew aircraft with no armor, no self-sealing tanks, minimal survival equipment. When they got hit, they usually died. When they survived being shot down, they usually weren't rescued. Every engagement, even ones where Japan inflicted significant American casualties, reduced Japan's experienced pilot pool while America's kept growing. By late 1944, American carriers were operating with near impunity throughout the Pacific. The Big Blue Blanket, another Thach innovation, kept continuous combat air patrols of Hellcats over the fleet from dawn to dusk. Japanese kamikaze attacks were the last desperate option for a military that had lost air superiority completely. Even kamikazes had trouble getting through the defensive screen of Hellcats, which would intercept them 50-60 miles out from the carriers and shoot them down before they could threaten ships. The final tally was staggering. Hellcat pilots were credited with 5,156 enemy aircraft destroyed, 75% of all naval aviation victories during the war. The kill ratio was 19-1. For every Hellcat lost in air combat, 19 Japanese aircraft went down. Some sources put the total Hellcat kills even higher, at 5,223, when including aircraft shot down by Marine Corps and British Fleet Air Arm Hellcats. The aircraft produced 306 aces, pilots with 5 or more confirmed kills, more fighter aces than any other American aircraft of World War II. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu shot down 19 enemy aircraft flying Hellcats, including 6 in a single 8-minute engagement. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace, scored 34 kills, all in Hellcats. These men weren't superhuman. They were well-trained American pilots, most from small towns and farms, flying an aircraft that had been designed with their survival in mind and employing tactics that turned their individual abilities into collective dominance. The Thach weave's influence extended beyond the Hellcat, beyond World War II. The principle that coordinated teamwork beat individual superiority became foundational to fighter tactics across all modern air forces. The Finger 4 formation, with 2 pairs of fighters operating together but able to separate and provide mutual support, evolved directly from Thach's matchstick experiments on his kitchen table. Vietnam-era pilots still learned the Thach weave. Modern fighter doctrine, even for aircraft carrying missiles that can shoot down enemies from dozens of miles away, emphasizes mutual support and division tactics traceable to what Thach developed in 1941. Japanese aviation never developed an effective counter. Part of the problem was philosophical. Japanese fighter doctrine placed enormous emphasis on individual pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability. The Zero had been designed around those principles. Lightweight meant exceptional maneuverability. Exceptional maneuverability meant skilled pilots could outturn anyone. But that philosophy assumed combat would be individual duels, one aircraft against another, like samurai with swords. The Thach weave made that assumption obsolete. It didn't matter how maneuverable your aircraft was if you were constantly facing guns pointed at you from multiple angles. Japan did try adapting. By late 1944, some squadrons were experimenting with four-plane formations similar to the American Finger Four. They tried coordinated tactics, but implementation was inconsistent and came far too late. The experienced pilots who might have made it work were dead. The replacement pilots barely had enough training to fly their aircraft competently, much less execute complex coordinated maneuvers under fire. And their aircraft, while still dangerous in the hands of an expert, couldn't match the Hellcat's combination of speed, firepower, and survivability. There's a deeper story here about how wars are won. It's tempting to focus on hardware. The Hellcat was undoubtedly a superb aircraft. 2,000 horsepower, 6 50-caliber machine guns, armor and self-sealing tanks. But Japan built capable fighters too. The Ki-84 Hayate, which appeared in late 1944, had performance roughly equal to the Hellcat. The N-1K Shiden Kai was an excellent fighter by any measure. Neither aircraft changed the course of the air war because aircraft alone don't win wars. Systems win wars. The Hellcat was part of a system that included pilot training, tactical doctrine, industrial production, logistics, and the institutional willingness to learn from combat and adapt. The Thach weave embodied that systematic approach. It wasn't a complicated maneuver. Any pilot could learn the basic mechanics in an afternoon. But executing it under fire, maintaining the coordination when you couldn't see your wingman, trusting that he'd be there when you needed him most, that required training and cultural buy-in that went far beyond individual technical skill. American naval aviation built that system. Japanese aviation, despite having many brave pilots and excellent aircraft designers, never quite did. John Thach himself never became famous outside naval aviation circles. He continued developing tactics throughout the war. The Big Blue Blanket, which kept kamikazes from devastating the carrier fleet in '45, was his concept. He rose to the rank of admiral and retired in 1967 after a distinguished career. The frigate USS Thach was named in his honor, but his most lasting legacy is something more abstract: the recognition that tactical innovation can overcome material disadvantages and that teamwork can beat individual superiority. The matchsticks on that kitchen table in San Diego in 1941 represented more than just a tactical solution to a specific problem. They represented a way of thinking about combat that rejected the romantic mythology of warfare in favor of cold pragmatism. American fighters were inferior. Accepting that truth, rather than denying it, allowed Thach to find a solution. And when better fighters arrived, the Hellcats that would dominate the Pacific skies, they carried those lessons forward, not as a crutch for inadequate equipment, but as the foundation of a fighting system that transformed individual capabilities into collective dominance. 5,171 enemy aircraft destroyed. That number, carved on memorial plaques and recorded in official histories, represents lives ended and battles won. But it also represents something else: the triumph of coordination over chaos, of systematic thinking over individual heroics, of two men with matchsticks on a kitchen table, working late into the night, refusing to accept that superior enemy aircraft meant inevitable defeat. The Thach weave, married to the Hellcat platform, didn't just win air superiority over the Pacific. It redefined how aerial combat would be fought for generations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.